Hi, everyone. Welcome to Jews on Film. My name is Daniel Zana. I'm a video editor and filmmaker based in Seattle, Washington, and still a Jew. As always, I'm here with my co-host, Harry. How you doing, Harry?
I'm doing pretty well, Daniel. As always, I'm Harry Odensasser, and you know the drill at this point. I'm a Jew, studied film. Hopefully that's familiar. I'll find another clever way to say that next week. But welcome back to our podcast. And this is a special episode because, Daniel, this is the first time in, probably 5-6 episodes that it's just the two of us again. It's just the two of us recording, talking about a movie we love.
That's it, man. We've had our matzah, for transparency's sake. This is just after Passover. So we've had our matzah, we've experienced freedom, we're free Jews, and we're here today to talk about Paul Thomas Anderson's movie, Licorice Pizza, starring Alana Haim and Cooper Hoffman, son of the late, great Philip Seymour Hoffman.
So Daniel,
yes,
it's just
Harry.
the two of us, and normally you take the lead on doing some of the interviews with some of our guests, but this is a movie I was very excited to watch with you and to hear your thoughts on. So I wanted to ask you some questions, if I may. Just
sure.
Share with me and the audience just a little bit more of your background and, why I thought this was a particularly special film for you. So I'll just get it out there. I know you grew up in the San Fernando Valley, and this is certainly a Valley movie. I remember, I remember we had an early conversation about it when the trailer came out and you were excited and, this was going to speak to you. So I guess just like, I wanted to ask about, what was that like growing up in the Valley, growing up, Hollywood movies? What was your relationship with that? And hopefully we can, learn from that a little bit about your past and transition that into talking about the movie. So what was that like for, a young Daniel growing up in the Valley?
When you grow up someplace, you don't know anything different, right? You think that's like how everyone grows up. And so like sometimes when I would drive over Laurel Canyon to go to school in like high school, you'd see like an old mansion and you'd be like, oh, that's where Houdini lived, or that's where the Red Hot Chili Peppers recorded their album. And you're like, oh yeah, sure. Everyone does that. We would oftentimes see like Jay Leno drive over the hill to go to Burbank from where he lived. And almost every day, it would be a different old car. Like he has a garage of cars. And so every day it'd be an old like 1920s weird car. And you'd see him speeding by with this sort of shock of gray hair. And you'd see him just kind of like driving around and stuff. And so I assumed that's, that was my reality, but also just being surrounded by people as I grew up and kind of went to film school. You're surrounded by people who want to get in the industry. And a lot of that in the film, I feel like our protagonist, Gary Valentine, is, a young kid actor, and he's kind of steeped in sort of that everyone's trying to get in and make it and audition for commercials. And so like I heard so much of that in college, and a lot of that sort of sounded familiar. P.T. Anderson grew up in the Valley. He's the director of the film. And I went to Cal State Northridge, which was in the San Fernando Valley. And a lot of his films were filmed, in locations in Northridge, locations for Punch Drunk Love and Magnolia and Boogie Nights. Like every time I would be going to and from class, I would see like the mattress store from Magnolia, or the donut shop from Boogie Nights, or the 99-cent store where Adam Sandler goes in and gets his pudding cups to get mileage and things like that. And so he was sort of like a local hero for us Valley kids. And I just really enjoyed his movies. So seeing this and seeing how he paid homage to the Valley, although it was a time that I was not aware of because it took place in 1974, I still really enjoyed the sort of Valleyness of it. And for context, P.T. Anderson was taught by the Haim sisters' mom for art class. And later, P.T. Anderson went on to direct a lot of Haim's music videos. So they have like a long history of working together. And in all of the Haim videos, they also grew up in the Valley. But all of their videos, a lot of them take place on Ventura Boulevard. They're walking around on Ventura Boulevard, things like that, and playing in clubs in the Valley and things like that. Overall, this is a huge win for the 818, which is the area code.
Shout out to the 818.
Exactly. So we're just very proud. We don't often get as much shine as like places like New York. Everyone watches New York movies and it's like played out at this point. So when there's a Valley movie, we've had Clueless from a long time ago, but now that we have this one, it's, we'll take our wins when we can get them.
Yeah, there was definitely some Valley representation in this film. I would argue it's a big character in the movie itself. So I wanted to ask you, and spoiler alert for, later in the movie, something that hopefully if you've seen the movie, you've figured out. And hopefully if you're listening to this podcast, you expected this, but there actually are some Jewish characters in the movie. One of our leads is actually Jewish. And I wanted to ask you, Daniel, as a Jew growing up in the Valley, you mentioned that, you didn't grow up in the exact same era as the movie, but did you see yourself on screen a little bit? Were there scenes where you were like, and we can get into the specific scenes when we actually discuss the movie, but just to tease it out a little bit, were there moments where you said, yeah, that feels like my childhood a little bit?
Well, I mean, I never like sold water beds per se, and I never started an arcade business. No, I didn't do that. I was never like a entrepreneurial kid like Gary. I had jobs, working at like a fabric store when I was 16. And I remember like putzing around and shooting music videos in the back alleys in North Hollywood. But I'm trying to think of like which of his friends. I definitely had a group of friends when I was in like the sub 18 category, like a group of friends who we just did like hijinks with. I think as all people do, you have your crew of people. Gary had his crew, his little brother, and then his little brother's friends and his friends. And they later became his like business partners, making phone calls and things like that. But not exactly. I think I'm more of a behind the scenes kind of person as an editor. I'm not the Gary Valentine type where I'm like charming people off their feet and trying to impress casting directors. That's not really my thing. Don't get me wrong. I love the attention, but I prefer to be sort of in the editing bay instead of in front of the camera. Yeah.
So with that, I think we should jump into the actual discussion of the movie, maybe go through it beat by beat and see how Jewish Licorice Pizza is.
Absolutely. That sounds great. I mean, before we get too far, I feel like I need to interview you now and sort of, tell us where you grew up, Harry.
I was going to say, when we do our like Northern New Jersey movie, like, sure, I'll give you my entire childhood, but right. I wasn't really watching this movie that, showcased, the San Fernando Valley about 2.5 decades before I was born. I didn't really feel so much relatability there. I wasn't really quite sure what a waterbed was until about halfway through the film. So
are you for real? You did not know that thing existed?
I'd heard of it. I'd like seen it. Like there's an X-Men movie where I think like, Days of Future Past, just to shout out another film where I think they like flash back to the 70s and like Wolverine kind of wakes up in a waterbed. So I was familiar with it, but
got it. Okay.
I never saw the appeal of it until this movie somewhat convinced me. I'm not going to, replace my mattresses anytime soon, but it was interesting to see the way he marketed it.
I have a very vivid memory of going to a friend's house. Shout out to my friend Jonathan Solomon. His older brother, I think it was either Elliot or Victor. It's always like older brothers, so they're at an age where they do the cool things. They introduce you to like cool music and cool movies and things like that. And so he had a waterbed in his room, and I remember going into his room and trying out his waterbed and just kind of like sitting on it and just kind of like floating around, and it was something I only need to try once. Like I'm fine with my mattress now. Yeah. But I think it was very of the time. That's my understanding of it. Why don't you hit us with that IMDb summary?
I definitely can do that. This is a short and sweet one, but I actually think it captures the movie kind of well. It reads, the story of Alana Kane and Gary Valentine growing up, running around, and going through the treacherous navigation of first love in the San Fernando Valley, 1973.
Harry, thank you so much for that lovely IMDb summary. Before we dive into the movie, let's take a quick break and we'll be right back with Licorice Pizza.
Welcome back, listeners, and we'll get started by running through the plot a little bit. So, Daniel, why don't you get us started? How does the movie open up?
So, like most Paul Thomas Anderson movies, it gets started with a beautiful, what's called a oneer, like a one-take shot, where we're just kind of like roaming through the scene, kind of getting introduced to our characters, similar to like Boogie Nights, where they like come in off of a crane into the club. So here, now we start at a high school, or maybe it's an elementary school, because I guess he's 15. So we meet our main character, Gary Valentine, who is 15 years old, and we see Alana Haim, or Alana Kane, walk by, and she's giving out combs and mirrors for people to sort of touch up their hair, and instantly he like charms her. He turns on the charm right away.
It's class picture day, right?
It is class picture day, and it is, everyone needs to look their finest. He's dressed up fairly nice for a kid in the 70s, buttoned up shirt, nice slacks, things like that. And instantly he's just charming her, and we're kind of going through the line and then going through the picture part, and they're just talking to each other. She doesn't give him the time of day initially, kind of brushes him off, and he doesn't take that as a no. He just kind of like is playful and coyly kind of flirting with her. And the conversation is still going as they are taking their picture. So he's charming her quite a bit. And eventually he's broken down her resistance. And she eventually reluctantly agrees to go out with him for dinner at his local bar called Tail of the Cock. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I think right away it's kind of interesting seeing this very like confident kid and, you know, sort of flirting with someone who early on we know is 25 years old, and she's working at a photography studio as an assistant. And so I don't know, what did you make of the whole, you know, it develops quite a bit. You know, he's a very mature 15 and she's kind of an immature 25-year-old. But, you know, what did you think of that whole relationship as it sort of progressed through the film?
Yeah, I think, you know, exactly what you said was where I was going to go with this, that they kind of outlined from the beginning kind of their social stature. Like there's this clear power discrepancy where she's like a chaperone kind of thing, or she's just part of the staff helping with these, you know, kids. Cause you, like you said, they're 15 years old and he's like this, you know, younger kid, but already their dynamic is outlined. Like he's very suave, confident, mature, is almost like come into himself as like, you know, and like an adult, like suave person, like inviting you, you know, out to dinner. And you kind of get the impression already from her character that she's a little bit less mature. Like she is, like you said, you know, she's acting sort of young for his age. He's kind of acting old for his age. And, you know, their relationship kind of begins as this coalescence of like meeting in the middle. You know, he's the one who has to like invite her out, and she's the one who's like a little petty and like, you know, hesitant about it. And then ultimately does agree to meet him there. And and I think you also get a really big, you know, from when they're seen in the diner, like in the dinner, you get the sense that he's like a real, you know, player, and you see the smooth talking and you see like this facade that he's kind of put up around her. And, you know, I think that the sort of entrepreneurial spirit that he has throughout the rest of the movie, and this sort of, you know, the way that he kind of tries to pull all these schemes throughout the rest of it, it's all very clearly set up, I think, you know, in that first scene with them.
You know, we sort of see, I think she's still, even after the initial dinner that they go out with, she's not entirely convinced. And you said that, you know, he sort of sets up this I'm more dominant thing. And then, you know, he needs a ride somewhere. So he calls her, or he needs a chaperone on a trip. He's not able to go on a trip to New York to do some sort of like talk show appearance. So then he asks Alana. Alana is able to escort him on this trip as a chaperone to fly to New York. It's at that point that he sort of shows off a little bit. And he walks by her in the hall and he says, just keep an eye out. I'm going to do a little joke just for you. So he does his whole musical number with I guess it's part of a movie that he was in. And he does this song and dance number. And then he smacks the old lady with a pillow. And I guess he's like kind of like winking at her. And Alana Haim's in the audience kind of like, I'm the chaperone. Like she's trying to elevate her own status as like being a chaperone. Everyone's like, shut up, just be quiet, listen to the, you know. But I think it's very interesting, her whole pursuit, you know. We'll get into it a little bit more later on in the film, but I think it's kind of like everybody trying to puff themselves up a little bit and sort of find where their place is at. Is Alana supposed to be an actress? Is Gary supposed to be an actor or a businessman? Like it all kind of evolves throughout the film. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to jump into that scene you were describing, right? It's the next scene after they go to that dinner. He needs her as a chaperone on this trip to New York, where he puts on this performance. And what I think is so interesting about the performance is you get the sense that there's like, he performs with a lot of younger kids, and there's this like dynamic where there's a lot of smaller, younger children, and he's playing, I think it's him and a couple of other of the actors are these like older, you know, children, like these, I guess, you know, 15. I'm still calling him a child, but he's a little bit older. And I think what that does for Alana's character is seeing him that way. Of course, there's the high of seeing him like as this exciting actor generating a lot of laughter. You can see her smiling when she sees that, but it also casts him as a sort of older, more mature chaperone figure to these younger children. In the context of the school where he's like surrounded by all these children and she's in that kind of older position, she's like, this is like a young kid. And I want to also point out that in the beginning, when they go on this sort of, you know, date, like they're never really quite dating in the beginning of the movie, and really like through the end of it, it never becomes more than a very close friendship. Maybe towards the end, you can argue they really, I mean, I think you do argue that they finally begin like the true relationship.
Sure.
But as this friendship is developing, I think it's a really important scene for her early on to see him in this light of, as he's sort of the older one, he's the older man on campus. He's like that older person on the stage with these younger kids. And when she sees him in this light, it kind of ages him up to her, to the point where she says, oh, maybe this person is, very mature for his age. And maybe he actually is, a little bit of, he still has the childish heart, he still hits,
right.
The teacher with the pillow because he, just wants to kind of get at her, but he definitely seems older than he might have in the high school or in the middle school.
But what about Lance? We have not talked about Lance.
Of course.
Lance is the other kid, though sort of the older kid who's like an actor as well. And, very good looking guy, ostensibly older than 15 years old, who's also on this trip. And, hits on Alana on the plane, looks out for her while they're doing the performance. And on the way back, hits on her some more. And then later on, when Gary comes back and is eating fast food with his mom, he sees Lance go out with Alana, and they always exchange looks with each other. Alana looking at Lance, then looking back at Gary in a way to be like, see, look what I'm doing. And trying to like make them jealous. And then Lance goes home with Alana. And it's at that point that we're introduced to Alana's family, her real life family, played by the other Haim sisters, Danielle and Esty, and then Moti and Donna Haim. Their characters named Moti and Donna and Danielle and Esty for simplicity's sake, I think. But it sets up like a very fun sort of like Jewish family dynamic. And it's at that point that Lance is asked, after the Haim sisters sing the blessing on the Shabbat candles, to say the Hamotzi.
V'tzivanu lehadlik ner shel Shabbat. Amen.
Lance, are you ready for nice dinner?
Very ready. Thank you for having me again.
Are you ready to do a barucha on the challah?
Oh, wow. Thank you. However, I must respectfully refuse. I'm an atheist.
You're Jewish.
Well, you're certainly right. I was born into Judaism, but my personal path has led me to atheism. You see, I just can't believe there's a God when I see all the suffering in the world. Vietnam, So, with all due respect, no, sir. I can't do the blessing, but thank you.
Creates this tension that ultimately leads in Lance and Alana's brief affair kind of ending. I definitely think we need to slow down and talk about this scene because,
for sure,
Jews on Film podcast, this is the moment where the movie becomes, very Jewish. And, the Jewish character I was teasing before actually is Alana's character and not Gary, because I don't think Gary's character is supposed to be Jewish, but, they put Alana, who, from her name alone, I think a lot of people might have realized that that's, like a Hebrew word, like Alana. So it's like a Hebrew name, but this is the scene where, they sit down, they have this, Sabbath, this Shabbat dinner together. And it's like, a few movies will take the time to really present that as this big moment. And this is not just a big moment, as like a Jewish centerpiece, but it's a big moment. It's meeting her family. It's seeing her vulnerability. It's seeing her, as this, it's framing her character as this sort of young Jewish woman who's bringing someone home to her family. And that's, a big sort of Jewish idea, a big Jewish trope of, marrying off your daughters at, maybe putting pressure on your young daughters at a certain age to kind of bring home a good Jewish boy kind of thing. And this scene really frames, I think, a lot of her character. So sure. I wanted to hear your thoughts, on, the framing of this scene and how this sets up her romantic pursuit with Gary, the non-Jewish character of Gary throughout the film. And then also go on a mini rant about, some of my pet peeves with this scene.
I sort of didn't love that Gary didn't get a similar scene where he had to reckon with his non-Jewishness, right? I mean, Lance is arguably a better pick for Alana. He's older, he's better looking, he's got his stuff together. He was actually like starring in movies. So from like a success standpoint, he's more successful than Gary as an actor. And he's Jewish, maybe he was born Jewish, but like, I think the fact that he wasn't willing to say the blessing on the challah and like insulted her dad, maybe that was like, really, you couldn't have just done it for my dad? Because
otherwise he seems like you said the perfect candidate,
Totally. And she calls him out on it, I mean, she says,
what does your penis look like?
What?
What does your penis look like?
Like a regular penis, I guess.
Is it circumcised?
Yeah.
Then you're a fucking Jew!
I mean, she calls him out on it. It's like, I'm curious to hear what your sort of criticisms or pet peeves are about this particular scene.
So, I mean, everything you were just saying about like him being set up as the right character, I think that's really smart. And I really think that, this Jewish lens of like setting up the movie as her trying to find, and not that that's her goal necessarily the entire time, but, of how does Gary fit into this? Like by using, this foil and like setting up this character as like, the on paper good Jewish boy, and then seeing how insulting it is to her family when he like won't reckon with his Jewishness. It really does set it up like, how much does Alana really see a future with Gary versus how much is he just like, this fun friend relationship thing that she's just kind of keeping around? Like, is he really the kind of guy that's going to come home like with her family? And like you said, like we never actually do get a scene like that. So maybe he's not going to fit there. So all that is great with the scene. Thematically, emotionally, seeing Jewish representation on film, always a great thing. I love it.
But
I could be wrong about this, and maybe I'm just not aware. But the tune that they sang for the blessing that they make on like on the candles or on like and I think it's Kiddush, like on the wine, like during the meal, is very recognizably the tune that I know a lot of Jewish people use for Hanukkah, for the night of Hanukkah, when you're saying when you're lighting on the candles. And I will admit that it's possible that there are traditions that use that tune also on Friday night, but at least in my familiarity, I have never ever heard that. And it feels to me like the filmmakers knew what they were doing and just decided a regular, Friday night, like prayer, like that's not so cinematic. Let's do the one with a really good tune. Like, yeah, we'll take the one from Hanukkah, and like, no one's really going to notice. They're just going to hear a good tune and think like, this sounds nice. And I noticed. And again, I could be wrong. It's possible that people have used this, but if it is what I think it is, I'm a little bit disappointed with their lack of commitment to accuracy, to Jewish accuracy, the way that I've come to expect from some of the movies that have really delivered.
I mean, to quote the most recent holiday that came up, Passover, if they would have shown a film with Jews starring Jewish actresses, Dayenu, it would have been enough. If they would have shown a Shabbat dinner scene, it would have been enough, Dayenu. If they would have shown a Jewish dinner scene and they said a blessing on the candles, it would have been enough, Dayenu, for me. But now you're saying you're splitting hairs that they didn't use the right tune and you're calling issue with it? Come on,
Daniel, as the person
I want to push
who was,
back, man. That's
I know,
like, they're singers. It sounded great. The Haim sisters are amazing singers. Come on.
You know what? As the person, Daniel, you're letting me down. As the person who was so upset about the Yentl, about the English and the lack of the accents, and
I know. Come on, that's so different.
I know that's finer, but it was like, I love your like Dayenu, that would have been enough, because it's like they should have just stopped, like quit while they were ahead. It was so good. They were showing it. It was all there. Yeah. And then, you know what? Again, I could be in the minority here, but just hearing that tune, I was like, oh, like you pulled me out of it a little bit. It's the same as like when people like get up to like the blessing and like and I don't remember exactly how they recited it here, but like they clearly just don't have like the pronunciation right, and they do like the hard ch instead of like trying the ch or something. Or
did they do that in this movie?
I would need to go back and remember.
Okay,
I don't want to exactly. Sure. I don't want to criticize them without knowing that for sure. But it's when they do something like that, and it's like, like you were so close. I get you had the right idea, but so this one, when they threw in that tune, I was just like, what? Like, why are we pulling that tune in there? Like that is like, for someone who's paying attention, you're throwing me off here.
But I mean, it is a melody that people use, and it's a great melody, and they are singers. And let's allow for a little artistic license. I feel like it's so different than Yentl, when like it's a film that takes place in Eastern Europe, and she's talking like she's, like, to quote Rebecca Finkel, friend of the pod, sound like they're from Flatbush. I think it's totally different, but I respectfully hear your suggestion and criticism, but I'm going to agree to disagree on that one.
I'm okay to leave it at that, but just, when we get back to ranking this film's Jewishness, it might just sneak in there. It might etch into my final ranking, but I'm not going to spoil that anymore. Yikes. We can move on in the movie.
Okay, let's move on. All right. So Alana is done with Lance. He did not say the blessing on the challah, and therefore he is out on the curb. But that doesn't stop Alana from seeking out people in her world, in the valley, to find someone to be with. She later tries out and auditions for, some acting parts. Gary introduces her to an agent, and the agent says some real weird stuff, man. This is another scene when like Judaism is sort of, there weren't too many of these scenes, but this is a scene where it's sort of Jewishness is sort of front and center in the film. You know, all the whole time, Gary, being the hustler that he is, tells Alana, just say yes to everything. Just say yes to everything and they'll book you for a part. And so the agent says, you know, do you ride horses? Yes. Do you fence? Yes. Do you play soccer? Yes. And what languages do you speak? Hebrew. And then she says, Portuguese? Yes. You know, all these other things. Would you take off your top? Yes. And then Gary looks at her. You're taking off your top. You know, he gives her crap for that later. But I think unprompted, the agent just looks at her and says,
Gary tells me that you've been studying at Every Woman's Village with Milton Farmer.
Yes.
I love his work with young actors. He is a miracle worker. You have a warm smile, which is very powerful. And you have a very Jewish nose, which is becoming very fashionable. I'm getting a lot more requests for Jewish girls.
And she really takes it in stride. And I want to give her credit for that. I think the Jewish nose, you know, it came up a lot with Strei-SAND when she was acting and, you know, very famously did not, you know, alter her nose. Star of previously discussed film Dirty Dancing, you know, Jennifer Grey famously also altered her nose after she did Dirty Dancing because a lot of people told her that she had a Jewish nose, and that really, you know, affected her career negatively. She had like a number of surgeries afterwards, and she wrote about it in her recently released autobiography. So the whole Jewish nose thing, let's pause on that for a minute and talk about that.
That is like, you know, one of the most Jewish, you know, caricatures, tropes, like, you know, it could be a very harmful negative stereotype, but it's certainly something that's, you know, very present. A lot of Jewish actors, comedians will point attention, you know, will call attention to their sort of Jewish features. And there's a lot of Jewishness in this film. Like a lot of our films we discuss here, I'm more and more convinced of its Jewishness as we go through. But, you know, as this character is like, you know, trying to break it into Hollywood, like that is a big thing that like you were saying with the Strei-SAND, which I love the Barbra Streisand stuff because this movie has plenty of it and we're going to get to her later. But I think there's a clear analog to that because it's like she wants this. She has Alana's character has all these like, you know, these dreams of like making it. She's kind of like feeding off of Gary's, you know, entrepreneurial and ambitious spirit. And she's
totally,
you know, yeah. And she's like making these like, you know, making something of her career. And this is kind of the first path she goes down. And she's like, maybe I'll be a movie star. And, you know, we see a lot of like the road bumps that get in the way, but it seems like it's almost, you know, like from the beginning, it's kind of like doomed in some ways because I think she has this very uniquely Jewish feature, this critical, you know, Jewish nose that, you know, this casting director, after all of like the positive, like after like, oh, wow, you do all this is great. Like, you know, it's a lot of like upward momentum and it's like, but you have this Jewish nose. And to remind me, does she say like that could be like a good thing? Or she's like, that could be interesting? No, that's my wishful thinking.
I think her only criticism was basically after Alana said no to taking off her top in movies, the casting director was saying, you know, you could lose out on a lot of work. That was really her only feedback, which is kind of like, I mean, she pointed out her Jewish nose, I think, twice in the scene, and then also mocked Alana when she said that she knew Krav Maga. And the agent said, do you mean, what'd you say? Quick Draw McGraw? And that's for those who are not aware, that is a Hanna-Barbera cartoon character. But I thought that was something fun to call out because, you know, I think the awareness of Jewishness now in popular culture is much greater than it was in the 70s, at least in Hollywood, where before, you know, being Jewish was sort of something that maybe you just kind of do on your own time and you don't talk about it. Now it's like much more mainstream as a lot more cultures are, you know, becoming more mainstream and more, you know, they're doing Pixar films about this or they're showing up on TV there or indie films or all that kind of stuff. And I think it's great. You know, hopefully casting directors are not doing that kind of stuff anymore, but I'm not really sure because I'm not doing auditions and stuff like that. But anyway, you know, what you were saying before about Alana sort of trying out different paths, you know, as Gary, who's a very confident person, sort of progresses with his courtship of Alana, who is still, up until this point, has not really given him any sort of indication that she's interested in pursuing him. He goes to a wig shop, he discovers a waterbed and sits in it. And then the next scene, he's now like hawking waterbeds professionally with his band of characters, like his 14, 15-year-old friends. And Alana sort of tags along. And she, like you said, Harry, she's swept up in the enthusiasm and the excitement of it. They're calling people on the phone and they're selling tons and tons of waterbeds. And it sort of reminded me of like a scene from like Goodfellas or some sort of casino when they're just like, counting out dollar bills in the back of the restaurant. And the mom, Gary's mom is involved. She's like a stage mom sort of, and sort of helping him in his career. He's using her office space. Kind of interesting to sort of see that progress and sort of see him, be sort of successful at such a young age. Such an entrepreneurial spirit.
Yeah, it's definitely that like Goodfellas montage kind of thing where it's like things are really working out. And especially as like the relationship is progressing, a lot of it, through Alana's character, who I think I'm going to argue might be like the point of view of the film, is really like the lead. But, as she's watching Gary's character actually find the success that he said he was going to have, it almost legitimizes him in her estimation. Like we spoke about Lance earlier and how he seemed like this perfect, fit for her family. Like he seemed like this perfect, this is a concept we're going to throw around a little bit throughout this podcast, but like the sort of nice Jewish boy, that perfect, like good, sweet Jewish boy that Lance ultimately isn't. We kind of know him to be a little bit of a jerk, but at least seems like the perfect Jewish boy, successful, smart, kind of thing that like you'd love to take home to your parents. And, after Lance kind of fails that test, we're kind of watching now Gary through that frame. Like, is he just like this, high school dropout kind of failed actor thing that, might not make it, but all of a sudden it's like, oh, he has this actual, booming waterbed industry. And he's actually pretty capable and entrepreneurial. And it's, watching him kind of progress through Alana's eyes. It's like, oh, this guy actually, he might be, he might not be all talk. He might actually know what he's doing.
I'm skipping a scene, I think, because Gary meets up with Alana after a while at a teenage fair, and he's sort of selling waterbeds, trying to sell them to other teenagers, I guess. Maybe they would ask their parents for money, things like that. And then all of a sudden, kind of out of the blue, it didn't really seem to fit with the film, but he gets like put in handcuffs and taken away by the police, and sort of abruptly, and is taken to the station. I guess he's falsely identified for being a murder suspect. And it's at that point Alana's like pounding on the window and sort of reaffirming her fondness for him. She's running after the police car, chasing him down. Finally, she gets to the police station. They are able to free him, and they go out and they are walking together, and they kind of catch up. But I don't know. What did you think of that scene? It seemed kind of weird to me. I don't know what purpose it served the film.
Yeah, I think the scene is like a little bit before the acting thing. And I think it's like strikes a little bit of like passion, for their love affair, because like we said, like they are, it's more of a friendship for a lot of the film. And I think putting him in this like sort of shocking, situation for her, I think that really like elicits this very excited response, like in a very like impassioned way of like, what's going on? She like chases after the car. Like she tries to like, she runs like after him and like tries to take care of it, like tries to get him out of there. And like, I think that adds this component to their relationship that's like very impassioned, and it like kind of maybe casts for the audience this sense of like, oh, they actually really like each other and this could be something very romantic. But I'm sure for her, it makes her feel like, oh, wow, I really care about this person. I just kind of ran after him. And I think also seeing how Gary plays it off a little bit coolly and like, he's like stressed about it, but, ultimately like walks out of it. I think that also builds to his character. And then when the waterbed scenes and all that stuff happens afterwards, it kind of establishes him as someone who's, wise beyond his years and is more capable than at least he initially seems.
Yeah, definitely not a nice Jewish boy, the kind of person who gets like arrested for maybe murdering someone.
Yeah, not quite. Although when he's ultimately, revealed as like a false suspect, maybe that kind of like says, oh, you know what, maybe not as bad as I thought.
I did want to talk about the Jack Holden scene. So Sean Penn plays a director, and Alana is trying out for parts, and she tries out for a role, and then after her audition, she goes out in a sports car with Jack Holden. They zoom around, they go to his favorite bar. He's impressing her. And then, Jack Holden sees Rex Blau, kind of a Jewish sounding name, but I don't know, played by the great Tom Waits. And so they're doing shtick, like essentially Tom Waits asked them to get Everclear and some rags and a bunch of chairs, bar stools. And essentially what is happening is a poor man's recreation of an action scene from Jack Holden's earlier career. So Jack Holden is an actor based on William Holden, an actor of the era. And so
tonight we have a man who needs no introduction, really. His name is Mr. Jack Holden. That's right. And if you've seen his pictures, then you know that every goddamn one of them has got Jack riding a motorcycle as if it's the only way to travel. And for those of you who perhaps may have seen a little film called The Bridges of Tokosan. Yeah. Jack and the beautiful Grace Kelly. Well, tonight, you're lucky, because tonight, we bring Toko-san right here to Encino. On your feet now, follow me to the 8th hole.
Rex Blau is lending his motorcycle to Jack Holden, who's going to jump over a fiery collection of bar stools on a golf course with Alana Kane on his back with her guitar on. And, you know, while they're chatting, sort of, Alana feels like she's sort of moved up a little bit, you know, graduated from Gary, and then immediately realizes that she's just an accessory in this conversation. She has no idea what they're talking about. They don't engage with her at all. She's just kind of like jewelry, you know, but she does see Gary going out with a 15-ish year old person at the same place. And he wants to make sure that he's sitting with a line of sight, is what he says. And they just make eyes at each other the entire time. But I just thought it's a very interesting thing. And then what happens?
She rides on the back of Holden's motorcycle and kind of holding on. And almost immediately he sets off on his motorcycle and she flies off the back of it. And she completely like lands behind. He doesn't turn around. He doesn't, you know, Jack Holden continues the jump. Everyone celebrates him. No one notices. But the only person who does notice her on the ground is Gary. And he sees her lying there on the ground. He had followed like the whole, you know, the whole hubbub of the bar out to see this thing happening. And he runs at full speed towards her. And then they connect and embrace in this, you know, sort of climactic moment. There's a great needle drop, you know, this Wings song, this Paul McCartney song kind of plays. And there's this big magical moment where they're, you know, together at last. And it's like after, again, surveying other options. And like you said, after she has this encounter with another sort of very toxic, very masculine, very indifferent character, you kind of get this moment of embrace where it seems like, you know, maybe they really are the ones who are right for each other. Maybe all along they've really cared for each other more than anyone else. And, you know, for this brief moment in the middle of the film, all seems kind of well with them. And they seem like they're together and on the same page.
For the time being, yeah. The waterbed selling sort of somehow after there's an oil embargo, and Alana uses her sort of 25-year-old grown-up brain to realize what the news is telling her. And so she tells Gary, like, you know, our business is dry because there's an oil embargo and waterbeds are made from vinyl and vinyl is made from oil. So their business is kind of going belly up. But I think the last sort of delivery they make is to producer and boyfriend of Barbara Streisand, John Peters, played by Bradley Cooper. I thought it was a great performance, but he is kind of a jerk, like a real womanizer, admits that he has a problem, but immediately sort of puts Gary in his place, talks to him about how he was late. And if he messes anything up, he's going to fuck him up and he's going to put stuff in he's going to do all sorts of things to him. And sort of immediately, you know, you're not a man. I'm a man. I'm going to drive away in my Ferrari because I have gas in my tank and I'm going to get out of here. And that's kind of a funny scene. I feel like that whole set piece is like very bizarre and weird, but it also is very much like P.T. Anderson. It reminded me of the scene in Boogie Nights where they're at like a drug dealer's house to get drugs, and there's someone like throwing firecrackers on the floor and it's just like weird sort of what's going on here. But yeah, I wanted to get your thoughts on that whole scene. And then Alana's whole driving of the truck really started taking control of it. boy.
So
She did that driving in real life, by the way. She got stunt training on how to do that. It's amazing.
it's impressive. So just to start on all that John Peters stuff, I mean,
Yes.
that I agree with you is probably the most electric sequence of the whole film. You know, every second that Bradley Cooper is, I thought he was awesome in there. And he is actually a real person, a real character, and apparently was like a big character in the San Fernando Valley. I know it's a little before your time, but I'm sure people on the streets, knew to avoid John Peters. And,
Sure.
one moment that deserves to get a shout out from our podcast is where he insists that Gary pronounces his girlfriend at the time's name correctly.
Do you know who I am?
Yeah.
Do you know who my girlfriend is?
Barbara Streisand?
Barbara Streisand.
Sand.
Sand, yeah, like sands, like the ocean, like
Barbara
beaches.
Streisand?
No, like Strei-SAND.
Sand.
Streisand.
Streisand.
Barbara Streisand.
Barbara Streisand.
You fucking with me? All right, let's get past that. Hopefully you'll never fucking meet her. You think I'm bad.
Streisand.
Like sand in the desert. Yeah.
Exactly. And I hope we got it right. I don't know if we have to go back to our Yentl podcast and just sort of like edit, insert each of those like Streisand, make
Yeah,
sure we got it. But he is this eccentric character. I would say the way I would describe him is in terms that probably were not used in the 1970s at the time this film was taking place, but he is probably a big example of toxic masculinity, I would say. This very, like you were saying, this like womanizer, this very intense, this like, I'm going to scare you. Like it wasn't necessary for him to say, like, if you do anything to my house, like I'm going to beat you, I'm going to mess you up, I'm going to kill you, like whatever. Like probably not necessary, but he was just intense. I don't know if this is true to the history, but probably on coke or something at that point, and just, very intense. And again, like, connecting. I think this film, it's two things. It's a little bit of just like, it's this hazy like memory of the San Fernando Valley. And it's kind of this like, this movie kind of bounces from these like crazy moments to quiet moments to these just like very erratic things. So in one sense, I think the film doesn't sort of ask for a sort of like narrative connective tissue. Like it almost wants to just be these like loose episodes that are these like hazy memory of like, of Paul Thomas Anderson's childhood growing up in the San Fernando Valley. But, even though I think that's generally the vibe of the film, I do think that a lot of these characters we meet, I really do want to insert them in the framing of the relationship between Gary and Alana and how,
Sure.
Who she kind of compares him to and how she sees him. Because I think especially after seeing the character of Lance, this is like the next sort of very, in like physical presence, this sort of like brooding male character in the film. And I think he's an example of, the opposite of the NJB we were talking about. Another sort of contrasting point to that, where he is this very intense, very like womanizing, like very, the NJB, the nice Jewish boy we're talking about, this sort of trope is often characterized as being a little bit quiet, a little bit effeminate, like a lot of Jewish stereotypes, not very confrontational. And he is literally the opposite. So, in some senses, I think seeing him kind of confirms for Alana, I actually am with one of the good ones, and Gary, for all of his, mistakes, he's not this, and like I could do so much worse. And like I said, in other senses, this is just this, ridiculous comical character that was definitely running around at the time.
I will mention real quick that John Peters does make a move on Alana. Like he's trying to drive by his Ferrari that ran out of gas coming up the hill. And so after they flood his house with a hose as sort of an FU to him because he wasn't a nice guy. Again, Gary showing off to Alana about how much of a badass he can be. They are then caught with him in the car, and he's, trying to get real close to her face and kind of uncomfortably kind of like, I would call it maybe sexual assault. Like that's what we would probably call it.
I'd say so.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's like unwanted touching and kissing from him. I think that's what that was. And, like you said, it sort of reaffirms that Gary's one of the good ones. And now Alana is kind of a little burnt out, I think, like it's sort of, I would say it's getting to be rock bottom for her in some ways, that she's hanging out with a bunch of 15-year-olds, running away from a crazy coked up producer, driving a box truck backwards with no gas. I mean, the kids are very excited. I mean, she looks sort of beside herself that this thing has even happened. And she looks over and she sees all these 15-year-old boys sort of pretending to fillet a gas can and like playing around and like hump each other. And like, cause that's like the funniest thing in the world. But she realizes that she's a 25-year-old person, and, she really doesn't need to be doing this kind of stuff, hanging out with kids. So it's at that point that she reconnects with a classmate who is staffing for a city councilman, Joel Wax, played by the great Benny Safdie. Yeah.
Joel Wax is a real politician, and I looked into it a little bit, and he actually is Jewish. He was a Jewish person, a real human person.
A real human Jewish person.
Father was a Jewish immigrant from Poland who ran a grocery and a butcher shop, according to Wikipedia.
And there's a bit of a surprise here, but I'm not going to spoil it. But Alana finds her purpose working here. Everything seems well. But, they do sort of allude to Joel Wax's personal life. He is interviewed by a few reporters, and they ask about...
Certainly you have some prospects.
I can't tell you how many times I've heard, boy, have I got the girl for you. And met some pretty magnificent women through my district residence. But I'll tell you what I tell them, and that's, sorry, but my time is spoken for.
And so you start to sense that something's a little bit different about Joel Wax. Alana is sort of seeing him as sort of a very charming, charismatic leader person, but there's something up about him. So, yeah, what do you think about Councilman Wax?
It's an interesting part of the movie where, like we said, until this point, like Alana and Gary, as much as their relationship, their friendship has grown, they've never really, confessed their sort of true emotions. And there's never been this kind of coming together. And this is kind of another pin in that where it feels like Alana's spending a lot of time with, Mayor Wax or potential Mayor Wax, and Gary and Alana actually take some time and like they both work on the mayoral campaign a little bit. And Gary's kind of up close the same way that, we had seen scenes earlier of, Alana kind of looking on as Gary was with, his 15-year-old girlfriends, like kind of in school. There's this sense of, Gary's jealousy here. And there's this brief moment where Gary actually learns about, like the legalization of pinball and arcade machines, like, from Joel, and that kind of sends him on his next endeavor. But,
his next hustle, yeah.
His next hustle, exactly. That's another word for it.
With the discovery of the pinball, Alana actually has a very good line where she says,
You're talking about pinball machines. I'm a politician. I need to get my life together.
So get it together.
Yeah, I think that there's this like another kind of moving away from each other where it's almost like they've grown out of each other a little bit, where Gary kind of has his next hustle and Alana for the first time really refuses to help with that one. And, at the same time, Alana is like developing her own entrepreneurial spirit, and she's kind of pinning it on this, Joel Wax.
We spent the day with a great man who's really trying to make a change on how this city runs. And the only thing you fucking heard was pinball machines are about to be legal.
I heard other things too.
And it's almost like there are two ambitions we've been watching through the film. First of all, her professional career ambition of like, being a mature adult and like creating something for herself. It seems like, and she says it in her own words. She says like, I'm doing something, very serious here. And like, it's kind of, you see it playing out for her in that regards, but then also a little bit of the romantic and emotional, leads that we have. And, you alluded to it before, but she sees, Joel Wax as this kind of potential, suitor, to the point that there's a scene where he calls her and he invites her out to join him for dinner. And, you can see in her excitement that she thinks that maybe this is turning into, maybe he is going to be a potential romantic partner for her. And, just to hold up, Mayor Wax, compared to some of the other characters we've been talking about in this film, he feels like the NJB, the nice Jewish boy that this film has kind of been building towards. He is, he's like, he's driven, he's, in politics, he's going towards, something professional. He's unlike, Lance, he's very nice. He seems very quiet, almost, effeminate in the way we were talking about as like the, the sort of nice Jewish boy. And it feels like he is the character that, this film could end with them starting their relationship, Alana bringing him home to their family, and, all living happy. She found like the mature, responsible adult she went. But ultimately, there is a twist, and I know you were alluding to this, but we find out at the restaurant that Joel is actually, he's gay, and he was only inviting Alana out to dinner as a sort of cover for the press, so that they would see him leaving with a woman and not be led on to the fact that he was gay, because as even now it's still a very challenged and sort of provocative thing to a lot of people. But he didn't want his mayoral campaign to be hurt by a lot of the negative impressions that a lot of people had of gay people at that time, as a lot of people still do today. So it ultimately crushes a lot of her dream at once, because it shatters some of the ambitions of, I think her career wise, where it's like this guy is holding this big secret and who knows what's going to happen with it. And like, maybe this isn't going to be the sparkling future that she was building for. But then obviously romantically, as a gay man, he is not the sort of nice Jewish boy that she might have been hoping to bring home to her parents. So that's kind of shattered right before her eyes.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like, I mean, my mind, as you're describing it, immediately contrasts the sort of two dinner scenes where she's sort of a pawn. So Alana, in the case of Jack Holden, is sort of eye candy. And in the case of Councilman Wax, I would say she's like a beard. So according to Wikipedia, a beard is an American slang term describing a person who is used knowingly or unknowingly as a date, romantic partner, or spouse to conceal identity or to conceal one's sexual orientation. So essentially, she's like a decoy. So that's
exactly what's going on.
So she takes home Councilman Wax's boyfriend, and she's kind of, it sucks for her. She can't catch a break, like you're saying. Career wise as an actress, she's trying to affirm her status as somebody who goes to dinner with a big director. She's just like arm candy, and then she goes with this councilman who she thinks is going to be a bit different, and she's going to be a big player in the political scene and make a big difference. And she's eye candy. She's a beard. It's rough going for her. And then she kind of realizes that, maybe she's not meant to do either of these things right now. Maybe she's just meant to be with Gary. So after she, walks home with Councilman Wax's boyfriend, she gives him a nice big hug. And then she kind of goes off to Gary, who's having a huge sort of pinball grand opening for Fat Bernie's pinball parlor. And, his little team of entrepreneurial kids have been handing out flyers all over the place, and there's a grand opening. And so tonight's the night where she runs to the pinball parlor, and Gary is looking for her. He sees the other Haim sisters. They say that she's at the councilman's office. They run this way, that way. And eventually they run to each other. They embrace. I think they profess their love to each other. They have one kiss in the film. That's it. And I believe that's where the movie ends.
Yeah. And I just want to jump into some of the stuff you were talking about, because I mentioned this earlier. I think that Alana is the center of the film. And I really do think that she's the perspective that we're kind of jumping into. And you just called attention to the fact by pointing out, these sort of dinners, comparing some of these dinners she goes through, that this film really is anchored by, I think, 4 dinners that she has, because she has her initial dinner with Gary. That's kind of the first one. Then she has her second one with Holden, and that obviously he represents like this really negative representation of a man. And then she has another one with, I skipped one. She has the second one with Lance. Yeah. And then the third one is with Holden. And then the fourth one is with, this sort of Joel Wax character. And it's like,
interesting.
And I think this idea of like, who do you want to like sit down for dinner with, bring home to the family, like get to know, like settle down with. I think that's like the big question of the film. I want to see where you're going with this, but what I'm trying to say is, I think that, we follow these 4 episodes, these 4 kind of frames throughout the film. And I think that's what the film is ultimately chronicling. It's her relationship with each of these men, and it's what she's looking for, and, how she's kind of anchoring her professional, her romantic pursuits to each of these men. And, when you get to the end, there's this question of, I think the movie is arguing in some ways Gary is like perfect for her and is like, the one she's been looking for all along. But it's also a little bit of like a reset, because like, even though they find each other at the end, it doesn't change the fact that Gary is 15 years old and it's who she was started with in the beginning. And there's this kind of cyclical of like, she started with Gary. It wasn't really, he was a little too young for her. It wasn't the perfect thing for her. She, tried out, 3 different kinds of people, the sort of, they're like the smooth, suave, like seemingly perfect, charming boy that ultimately like isn't, is a little bit snarky, doesn't believe in God, isn't like Jewish enough. Then, she finds someone who's like, like this really aggressive, masculinity. And then she finds someone who seems like the perfect kind of balance of sweet guy, Jewish, like nice character. And ultimately, he's gay and it doesn't work for her. And like that obviously can't work. And it's just like, after cycling through all these different potential, nice like men, her shuffling back to Gary in some senses is like, yeah, it was Gary all along. He really was great. And in some senses, it's like, she just hasn't really figured it out by the end. And I've spoken to a lot of people about this film who had very different, responses, either like, what a triumphant finish. I'm so happy they ended up for each other. They really bring out the best of each other. And a lot of people who were like, it's a little bit of a sad movie from her perspective. It's a little bit of a sad, like, she kind of doesn't find like that, maybe the perfect man that she was trying to anchor herself, her career to, maybe that doesn't exist. And, maybe it's a call for independence, and it's like, she can love Gary and like, have him out on around, but like, he's not going to be her avenue out into, the sort of the professional stuff. And I'm just throwing this stuff out here. I want to see your thoughts. You gotta save me from this rant because I don't know where to take it. But I just do think it's interesting that she has these shuffles through these relationships, and I'm not sure where she ends up afterwards if it's so positive.
I just ran out of licorice pizza. So why don't we take a quick break? We'll come back. I want to tease something because I have quite possibly the biggest stretch of this episode right after we come back. And we're back. I just got my licorice pizza, Phil. I am so full right now. You have no idea. So before you were just talking about all the different people, I wanted to see if I could have you join me along with this stretch. We have Lance, right? We have Jack Holden. We have Congressman Wax, and we have Gary. We have four guys, right? And these 4 guys have moms, right? And the moms have 4 sons. So maybe after just having come off of Passover, I feel like maybe these are the 4 sons, kind of alluding to Passover, and that each one maybe either has distinct traits, so in the Haggadah, the book that we read on Passover, there is a story of 4 sons. There's the wise son, there's the wicked son, there's the simple son, and the son who does not even know how to ask a question. Now, I haven't really thought through this stretch so much, but that's why I wanted to invite you along this journey to see if we could maybe map out some of these. I know who the wicked son might be, maybe like Jack Holden, but I feel like each one of these people has elements of wisdom, simplicity, evilness, not even know how to ask a question. I would say for me, for sure, like Gary is the wise son, because who else would know to pivot from being a child actor to selling water beds to getting into business about pinball machines? That takes a lot of wisdom. Maybe Councilman Wax is like the simple son. He's just kind of like vanilla, doesn't have any sort of grit to him. And then the one who doesn't really ask any questions might be Lance, because he doesn't say the blessing on the motzi.
I like where you went with that. I was going to argue maybe that's Holden, because he's the one who doesn't pay attention to her, doesn't really, ask
but he's
her anything,
evil.
doesn't even
I feel
notice.
like he's like the evil one because he's such a, he just strikes me as kind of of the people, he seems like the skeeviest kind of person.
He's really like the most just using her, doesn't care.
And then there's also John Peters, but I'm not really sure that he's enough of a romantic interest that Alana's actually interested in. So I was sort of putting him off to the side. Yeah. So maybe if there was a 5th son, they'd be like the cokehead son, or the sort of the son who asks for peanut butter jelly sandwiches.
Hi. Do you like peanut butter sandwiches? Peanut butter? Not really. No?
So that's my stretch. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that one.
I mean, it's a stretch for sure, but
yeah.
If we had Paul Thomas Anderson as a guest on this podcast, maybe if we have him for a later episode, we can ask him that question. And if he had the 4 sons in mind, the Passover, Alana, seeing her potential, her 4 sons laid out in front of her, might be there. I think it might be there, but yeah, I definitely think so. I think it really does legitimately fit into, I think, this view of the movie that we've kind of come to, where we're talking about how it's her engaging these, 4 different kinds of people, these 4 different kinds of potential, potential romantic partners, and just seeing different traits, and how they manifest. It's when, someone was too abrasive, too sort of Russia in her face, too kind of evil in her face, like we were saying. It's then she goes for the simple son, or then she goes for a quieter one. And, there are reasons why all of them don't work and all of them weren't perfect. Mm-hmm. And I do think it's interesting, pulling Gary as the clever, the wise one, the righteous one. Totally. I like the way you pulled back that. But I do think that the same principles that we have by the 4 sons, in the Haggadah, in the sort of book that we're reading at the Passover Seder, those principles of here are 4 different ways to approach different children, 4 different responses people have. Right. I think this movie is built off a very similar structure of here are 4 different examples of types of men that are kind of all bad.
One game that we like to play on Jews on Film is sort of what the sequel looks like. So what does Licorice Pizza 2 look like? And maybe we're going 10 years in the future, maybe 5 years, maybe even 3 years to when Gary's a legal consenting adult. So Gary's potentially 18 years old and Alana's 28 years old. What happens then? Or maybe 10 years when Gary's 25 and Alana is 35. What's going on? I wanted to sort of pick your brain and sort of, and the year also 10 years from that point would be 84. and 5 years would, or 3 years would be 77. So I'm not sure if you're clued into the San Fernando Valley goings on of that period, but just in general, what you think happens in the sequel to this film?
Well, I think if we launch far enough ahead, I think at one point they sort of encounter you on the street and maybe there's a scene where you wave to them, like you being young Daniel living in the San Fernando Valley.
Oh, got it. Sure. Because
once you're thrown out, a couple decades later, I mean, I'm not going to reveal your age or anything here, but you've got to be around at some point, 20,
Sure.
30 years after this movie, 50 years. I guess that's now. What do I think happens? I don't think this relationship lasts because I think, like I said, there's two views of this film. There's the more cynical view of this sort of cyclical, she falls back to this sort of comfort food for the time, or, the longer view of maybe they really are perfect and push each other. But it's hard for me to push the latter view, especially with the age difference, which we haven't touched on too much. I know that was a very controversial point with this film, the fact that he is underage and that this would technically constitute statutory rape, their relationship, if it, ever really got serious. So I think especially with that and just where she is, it feels like she kind of needs to be a kid for longer. That was the sense I got from the film, that all of these sort of ambitions she had and all of these attempts to kind of launch out to the world on other people's terms, on other men's terms, are ultimately not where she needs to be. I don't think that means that she needs Gary to do that for her, because Gary's, maybe too young for that. But I think it means she needs to settle in with Gary, someone who cares for her, someone who's really, great for her for another couple of years. But eventually I think she's going to find that path that makes a lot more sense for her with someone who's, just, I think, better for her, though, someone that's more supportive and more, possibly closer to her age, which I don't think would hurt. And that's kind of where I think this is going. They date, on and off for 2-3 years, but I think that's the extent of it. How about you? Have you thought about that at all?
I think you're right. Gary, unless he converts and says the blessing on the challah, I don't think it's going to last. I think the age difference is a big one, but I do feel like when she's around him, she feels her best self. She has fun. They do all this exciting, fun stuff. He mentions to her at some point,
Alana, you would still be taking pictures at my high school of children if it wasn't for me.
He's positioning himself as sort of the gateway for this incredible life that she's had thus far. Which of the 4 sons or which of the 4 types of people does she ultimately end up with? I mean, I would hope that she ends up with an NJB, but not like a total loser, but somebody who's speaks to her interests and takes care of her, is not like a shit bag, but a nice person, maybe who's involved with film, not necessarily a Jack Holden type, but somebody, a nice Jewish video editor. I don't know, something like
I thought you were pitching yourself in there. I mean, the timeline, we'd have to wait a couple of years. Exactly. I think you would have been younger than Gary. So we're really
No, I'm not pitching myself here, just to be clear. I'd be happy to see her with somebody who's not a Holden type, and not to be a beard for someone, and
of course,
not to be married to a shitty actor person who doesn't treat her nicely. So she seems, she proves herself to be a character who we want to root for, not like an anti-hero or something like that. Sometimes there's movies where there's a character and you ultimately are like, I don't really want to root for this person. They don't have so many redeemable qualities, but she does seem like someone who, we want to have end up with a nice Jewish boy in a good way. I see you're yawning, and that means it's time to wrap this podcast up. I would say let's close this thing out and let's talk about our ratings. Yeah, so now let's move over to talking about the film in terms of its ratings. We talked about the film, its plot points, things like that. Now it's time to, analyze it with a more specific Jewish lens. Shout out to our past guest, Gil Barron, who gave us an incredible suggestion for a criteria by which to measure this film. Harry, would you say this is good for the Jews, this movie?
I think that question is always going to be tied to how explicitly Jewish it is, which, we're going to get into now, because a movie is not necessarily going to be good or bad for the Jews if it's not obviously Jewish. But I do think that this movie has Jewishness in it. I think, it's undeniable. If you remember this movie, you remember the Sabbath dinner scene, you remember the Jewish nose comment. This movie is making it very obvious that it's Jews, and not in our usual stretchy way where we kind of, read into it like, oh, that's clearly a Jewish allusion. This movie is a Jewish. I don't know if it's a Jewish film. It's a film with Jewish characters. So I would say that Alana, as the Jewish character in the film, as being generally the moral and just the moral center and the protagonist of the film, and someone that I think, both you and I left feeling like she was the one we were most sympathetic to, and she was the one we're rooting for. And I think her Jewishness wasn't portrayed, wasn't caricaturized, and it wasn't made fun of. That was a great Jewish scene of their family coming together and singing. Like you said, the Haim sisters have great voices and harmonizing the Jewish songs together. Like, that's all really good looking, and the one comment, the negative comment about Jewish noses, I think is played to be like, that's shocking and offensive. So I do think that this is a pretty good movie for the Jews. I think this is good for the Jews. I would feel good about, wide audiences seeing this and saying, that was a pretty good Jewish character. I really cared for her. So Daniel, before we get into the actual, the Jewishness ranking, why don't you answer that question as well? Did you think this was good for the Jews?
I honestly think you took the words out of my mouth. Like, I don't have anything to add to that. I feel like all of those points are solid. I think every time Judaism was brought up in the film, I think Lance's stuff about not wanting to say the blessing on the challah was played for humor. I don't think necessarily, if anything, it sort of is a score for like tradition, right? Like Lance's excuse is just like, what? His sort of atheistic position on not saying a blessing on the challah is sort of played for humor and it's mocked. So it's sort of, supporting being a traditional Jew, whatever that means to you in 1974. But yeah, I think you hit all the points on the head. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So then let's get this conversation started about its Jewishness. So Daniel, what did you think about, we've spoken a little bit about the character, the cast and crew, the content, the theme. So how do those come together in this film and make it a Jewish film? Like, is this a Jewish film? Is it a film that has some Jewish themes in it? What do you say about all that?
It's worth calling out that the film, P.T. Anderson, not a Jewish person, but grew up in the San Fernando Valley. His wife, Maya Rudolph, is Jewish, I found out. And, the film was inspired by his friend who was a child actor. His name is Gary Getzman, who went on to produce a lot of things such as Silence of the Lambs, Philadelphia, That Thing You Do, Big Fat Greek Wedding, a bunch of stuff. So yeah, this is about his sort of growing up as a child actor. So sort of the inspiration for the film is tangentially, someone who happens to be Jewish. The depiction of all the stuff in the film. So cast and crew, I would say, is Alana is and the Haim family. That's our sort of sole main Jewish inspiration and representation in the film. Content wise, the Judaism does come up, as we talked about in the film, the Shabbat dinner scene, and then the Jewish nose comment, which kind of comes up briefly, and it's not really like a plot point, so I might pass on that. But the Strei-SAND thing also mentioned. I would say content wise, not as much. Thematically, I think there's a lot of stretches we could do. Like every time I saw Gary Valentine get dressed up, go into the tailor, it just reminded me of the scene from Yentl when she's getting dressed up. Reminded me of like trope of like a bar mitzvah suit. For those not familiar, like getting fitted for a suit for your bar mitzvah when you're coming of age ceremony, when you turn 13. It's an uncomfortable situation. Sometimes you go to a tailor, sometimes you go to a Macy's or Nordstrom's, whatever, and you wear this like ill-fitting suit and you're 13 years old, so you're like scrawny and your sleeves are too long and things like that. And sort of Gary, went to a tailor and kind of stepped it up a bit. He's got his pink shirt on with his like white suit. Even though he's not Jewish, I thought that sort of resonated to me as sort of a Jewish sort of scene. Again, kind of a stretch. But yeah, I think overall I would probably, I enjoyed the film a lot. I wouldn't say it was a Jewish film, so I'd probably just give it like a 2.5 out of 5 in terms of how Jewish the film was. I did like the film. I want to be clear about that. But yeah, overall, I would say my rating is maybe 2.25 out of 5 on the Jewish scale. How about yourself, Harry?
I think you covered it pretty well with the cast and crew, the content. I think, a lot of Jewishness behind the character, behind the camera, in front of the camera. There's definitely some stuff there. The content is stuff that we've gone through already. It's it's the Sabbath dinner scene. It's the Jewish nose thing. It's just, it's not throughout the film, but I definitely think it's pretty pronounced in a way that, you don't see in most mainstream films. I mean, this was, we're recording this a couple months after this film was nominated for a bunch of Oscars. I think Best Picture this past year. So, and definitely for a screenplay. So this was a pretty popular, mainstream film that, has some strikingly Jewish, content in it, I think. But thematically is what I want to focus on here, because I do think that this film has a lot of Jewish themes in it that we've kind of spoken about. And it's a lot of stuff that I've repeated, so I won't go into it too much, but just about this, that this concept of this character that's kind of in her 20s. I think it's very familiar to a Jewish experience that I've known personally, that I've seen up close, where, a young Jewish woman will be, in her sort of early to mid 20s kind of thing. And I think that there's a lot of pressure from, sort of like Jewish world to, when are you going to find, I know I've said this 1,000 times, but you're a nice Jewish boy. When are you going to find that good boy to bring home, start your family kind of thing? And that sense of pressure that I think is felt implicitly by her character throughout the film, as we're watching her, with these different romantic pursuits and kind of rooting for some of them and rooting against others and wondering, what's the direction she's going to find in her life. But I think it's made very explicit in the scene where she brings someone home to her family. And the reason that relationship ends, unlike the other ones, I mean, I do think Lance was a jerk, and I think the audience knows that. But the the explicit reason it ends is because the family, kind of doesn't approve, because he doesn't fit into the Jewish mold. He doesn't, he doesn't subscribe to the religion that, is kind of like necessary. So because that scene featured so prominently, and it's a frame that I think thematically is present throughout the film. And as we're watching her, as much as it's about her, career and her ambitions, it's also a lot about her, love life and the kind of pressure that, and maybe I'm reading this from my own Jewish lens, but the pressure I think that she's feeling to kind of find someone to settle down, like her siblings, like her, for her parents kind of thing. I actually think that is a very Jewish theme. It's a Jewish sort of theme that's carried through an otherwise, romantic film. Like not every, sort of film about like a young love coming of age kind of film has such a strong Jewish theme kind of presiding over it. So I'm going to give that credit, whether or not everyone kind of sees the film through that same lens. I do think it's there, and I think it's there enough for me to argue that it's there. So, unlike you, who had a little like 2 out of 5, 2.5 out of 5, kind of kept it on like the less Jewish than not. I want to make the claim that this is a more Jewish than not film. I mean, it had a real, Sabbath scene, and she is a Jewish character through and through, and that's kind of made reference to not just in one scene, but it's called back to throughout. So
Sure.
I'm gonna go 3 out of 5. Not the strongest, most Jewish film, but I want to argue more Jewish than not. So 3 out of 5 Jewish stars.
Great. Oh, okay. I thought you were going to go crazy, like 4 or 5 stars.
6 stars.
I did think about one scene while you were talking. The Haim sisters are not only in the Shabbat scene, they sort of come in and out of the story as Alana is consulting with her sisters about what to do. Her older sister works for the real estate business of the family, which is like another thing, working for the family business. But she does like smoke with her sister Danielle, and gets sort of sage-like advice from her. So you could also stretch that and say that Alana's visiting like the neighborhood wise person to get sort of sage-like advice, as one does from their older sibling, what do I do about this or that or the other? And I think it's interesting because she asks Danielle, she says,
Do you think it's weird I hang out with Gary and his friends all the time?
It is whatever you think it is.
I think it's weird that I hang out with Gary and his 15-year-old friends all the time.
And that's like a very Jewish response, right? Answering a question with a question. So I might go up to 2.5 now from 2.25. I feel like you've convinced me. There are a lot of Jewish elements in the film. Overall, I did really enjoy it. I wanted to ask, so do you know what VHS tapes are, Harry? Are you familiar with that, being a young person?
When I was younger, we had a couple VHS tapes in our home.
So long ago, there used to be a video store called Blockbuster Video, and there's still one in Oregon, if I'm not mistaken. There is one more Blockbuster Video, but it used to be a thing before Netflix and Amazon and all the other streaming platforms that you would go to a video store and you would pick up a tape and you would go home and put it in your VCR and play it for the day. The question I had for you, Harry, is where do you think Licorice Pizza would be? What section do you think in the video store would this film be?
You know, the big question is like, is this going to be in a Jewish film section? You know, if like there was like a whole like shelf dedicated to Jewish films, would you throw this here? It's probably not the first place I'd throw it. You know, it might be like the second. It might be if there's not enough room in the period piece section or like the sort of 70s like throwback, you know, next to the like the Dazed and Confused kind of section or the coming of age romance section. Like that's probably where I would assign this, where I would expect to find this first. But if it's getting a little crowded there and they don't want to kind of hide it in the back, could it bleed over into the Jewish film section? Probably not. But
yeah,
I think maybe, but it's probably more coming of age romance. Do you think so? Do you want to make the case that it would show up in the Jewish film section, or maybe not this time?
No, I'm not willing to die on that hill. I will say that it's kind of like interesting. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like this is one of the first and maybe only films that's like a more modern film that we've discussed on our podcast that sort of talks about days gone by, kind of, you know, like a modern film looking back into a period that has gone away, you know? So I thought that was kind of interesting calling back. So I feel like maybe it would either be an independent section. I wouldn't say it's like a major release. Like, you know, the film got nominated quite a bit and P.T. Anderson is a well-known director, but, you know, he's not like a Michael Bay or a Jerry Bruckheimer kind of person, you know? He's an art film director. But yeah, so I'd probably go romantic. I don't know if I would say romantic comedy, maybe independent. Would you watch this film again with some friends?
Yeah, I really enjoyed watching it. I saw it with friends the first time. I'll have to find other friends to bring it with, but I'm sure I could pull that together. I really enjoyed it.
That's good to hear. I think I would too. I want to watch it with my wife, you know, sort of, and just talk to her about, you know, how cool the Valley was, because she doesn't believe me.
Reminisce, so, exactly.
Exactly. Back in my day. Thank you, Harry, for indulging my 818 nostalgia and talking about a film. I would probably say that P.T. Anderson is my favorite director. So to be able to discuss, to mix my love of the Valley and P.T. Anderson, I really appreciate that opportunity.
Always happy to indulge. Just remember, you owe me one. Next time we find, you know, it's probably not going to be PTA, but another director who grew up in the 201 out in Bergen County, Englewood, New Jersey. When that time comes along, I'll make sure to have you on the podcast, and hopefully the film will be as Jewish as this one.
Thanks as always for tuning in. Have a good one. Bye. Jews on Film is hosted and produced by Daniel Zana and Harry Ottensaucer. Daniel Zana edited this episode. Make sure to follow us on Instagram at Jews on Film and subscribe to our podcast to get new episodes. Thanks for listening.